Hello, I'm Mike Winstanley, and I've been asked to give an overview of the sorts of industries that once existed along this Lune Valley. For those of you who are not sure where the Lune is, it goes up northeast from Lancaster. As you can see from this map, where Lancaster is, and this is the area I'm going to be looking at today. I'm not doing all the Lune Valley, it goes up a lot further, but I'm going to be looking up about as far as the sort of the Wenning and the Greta. As you can see, what's interesting about this valley is it's got quite a few tributaries. They're all to the south. So almost all the industries I'll be talking about are to the south of the river. And in fact, apart from where we are today in Halton Mill, there is virtually no industry on the Lune itself. So we'll be looking at some of the villages and the industries along these rivers. Now, in some respects, if you come at it from a landscape historian or somebody who's interested in the Lake District, you'll find that this is almost on the Lake District tour, the Lune Valley. Just around the corner from here at the Crook of Lune is Thomas Gray's View. This is a print from the 1830s, somewhat later. And as you can see, it says that it's essentially a perfect landscape of the extended sort. It's a pastoral, picturesque landscape. It's not viewed as industrial, but it's there. What's missing from this is a mill to the right, which should be visible in Caton at that time. So it's deceptive. It's quite surprising in many respects to find industry here. But what do I want to try and do today? Well, I want to look at the sorts of industries that were here from about the late 18th century into the early 20th century, and look about when they emerged, where they were located, why they were there in the first place, if possible, and from what we can find out, or this is quite difficult sometimes, who promoted them or ran them. It's easier from the mid-century to find out who worked in them, because we have census material, but who actually were the background of the tenants or the owners is a bit more difficult. And also more difficult is where they sold the products. But we can at least try and have a look. And just finish up as I go along, looking at what might remain of these industries today. Now, the bases of industry in the valley are all here, and they're all natural, is what I would argue. Water is essential for a lot of the industry. So I'll be looking at some water-powered industries that grew up here because of the nature of the terrain. But we've also got wooded valleys, and those provide resources for industry. Believe it or not, it's quite difficult to believe looking around now, there are coal deposits here, there are stone quarries, there are clay deposits, the shale, the Caton shales in particular, but it's throughout this area, the Bobbin shales. It's just that they are more accessible at Caton. We have got some wool. There is sheep farming, but wool is not a major raw material for this industry. But we also have flax. Flax would have been grown domestically and produced here in domestic industry at one point, but it's also an important element of the development of mills in particular from the late 18th century. But there are also some imported raw materials, and one of those is actually flax. Now, the water-powered mills that emerge, there's this one where we are today in Halton, which is the only one on the Lune. The Lune isn't really suitable for most water power. What we have here is Halton Force, so we have a drop, but otherwise it's a floodplain. There's virtually no buildings on the route on the Lune north of here. We've got various mills in Caton. We've got a mill, believe it or not, for those of you who know it, in Hornby at one point. We have a corn mill and a silk mill there, same building. We've got mill in Wray, was one in Wennington, very little known about it, mills in Benthams, Burton in Lonsdale, Ingleton. Almost every village, every settlement has some sort of water-powered mill. Now, silk is not what one associates with this area, and there are people working on this at the moment trying to unravel the history of Lancashire silk. This would appear to be brought up it's certainly been here since the early 18th century, it would appear to be obtained from Manchester merchants and possibly sold back to them. But there are some references to imports of silk from the Middle East or the Far East coming into the port into the early 19th century. But there's some silk mills. And flax too, although it could be grown here, isn't really grown here by this stage. That is also largely imported. And most of it would seem to come from the Baltic. And in fact, just up the valley from here at Bentham, there's been a metal detectorist who glories under the name of the Peace Havens, with Jed Dodd. It's a Peace Havens hoard. And he has been collecting and documenting and put them all on the web, so you can look at them at this address. Flax seals from bales of flax that are brought in from the Baltic into Lancaster, brought up by cart for operation in the mills at Bentham. The weaving would be done domestically at that point, but they are spinning the flax there. So that's imported from the Baltic. And we also, of course, have cotton. Now, we tend to associate cotton as the southern states of America. But the early phase, certainly when most of the mills here were initially established in the late 18th century and into the early 19th century, most of that cotton comes from the West Indies. And Lancaster is a major West Indian trading port at that time. So what you've got here is ships coming in from the West Indies in 1808, which is quite late, and I've underlined all the cotton that is coming in and who it's for. So you can see it's not just sugar that is coming in, it's West Indian cotton that is the basis at that point of the cotton industry here. And some of these names, Burrow, for example, is a name that you might come across a little later. Now, I'm not going to go through the history of every mill, because they are quite difficult to document the precise details of changes of tenants, because there are regular changes of operators, or indeed what they're used for, because most mills have different uses at different times. This is one mill, though, that I'll show you, give some example of one of the bigger mills at Burton in Lonsdale, Greta Mill. And this comes up for sale in 1808 because the owner is bankrupt and everything is being sold off. And it gives you a fairly good idea of the sorts of things that were in that mill. So he's got twist frames with 48 spindles each, but he's unfinished. It's almost as if he's run out of capital as he's building this. It's got a 16-foot water wheel, so it is water powered at that point. It's got some mules, spinning mules, presumably hand mules, and basically it's all on the most modern principle. But you wouldn't say anything different in an advert, clearly, except that it was the most modern. So we've got Burton in Lonsdale Mill, and it's not demolished till the 1920s. There's no sign of that now to speak of there, but it was clearly quite a large mill at one point. But Greta Mill at Burton in Lonsdale, this is at Wray, which was used for corn initially. It's a corn mill that's adapted. It's then used in the 1790s for silk. And this is an interesting partnership in that it trades under the name of a woman. I don't know of any other textile firms in the area, or indeed probably many elsewhere, that are operating under a woman's name, but in conjunction with two local men. So these are locally owned. But it's Thomas Hodgson, Margaret Hodgson and Company, no relation to the Hodgsons of Caton, who also had mills. But they end in 1790s. They're Quaker connections in there as well. Quakers appear quite regularly amongst the early mills here. So, but over the course of Wray Mill's life, it was a corn mill, a silk mill, then a cotton mill, then a bobbin mill, then a silk mill, and finished up as a sawmill or a wood turning mill. So it's this is Wray Mill, which is a very attractive looking place now, but it's now used for housing, such as and a lot of the works, the waterworks and the weirs, were all washed away in a major flood in 1967. So we just have the mill left. Halton, where we are now today, is the most extensive industrial site in the area, very long, and a couple of mills here, but again used for all sorts of purposes. There are references to twine spillers, there are references to silk in Halton, certainly post-war, but also much earlier, but we're not sure whether it was on this site or at a much smaller one elsewhere. It's a cotton mill in the early 19th century, and then it's oilcloth later on. But Halton, most of it's now demolished, but there is the building that we're in today. And you can get some idea of the people who operated these mills sometimes from newspaper reports, and particularly from the London Gazette, the business pages listing dissolutions of partnerships or bankruptcies and liquidation. And what you have here is a man whose name cropped up earlier, Thomas Burrow. Burrow and Mason were the importers of that cotton from St Thomas in 1808. And Burrow and Mason were Lancaster West Indian merchants. Their partnership had dissolved, but you can see that Thomas Burrow is actually in partnership with a man called Thomas Robinson to operate the cotton mill here. So Robinson's the name, Burrow is the money, and that's dissolved in 1810. But further down at the bottom, you can see George Burrow, his son, is in partnership with two other ex-West Indian traders who have got a silk mill operating in Caton. So a fair amount, I think, almost everywhere you look in the Lune Valley early on, there's probably a West Indian connection in many respects, not just the cotton, but also the money that it came in and diversified. Low Bentham silk mill was previously flax. That continued well into the 20th century as a Quaker-operated Ford Ayrton's site, a very extensive site, as you can see from that, and quite a paternalistic employer who had huge allotments there for his staff, and apparently was a good employer, but that now is housing, so that has gone. High Bentham, further up, that had High Bentham Mills, which is paradoxically at the bottom of this screen. As you can see on the map, it was a fairly extensive, it was then cotton, but it had been silk, it had been flax, and all of that is now a housing estate. Bentham still has a business, Angus Fire, or Angus Fire Armour as I still call it, which is making hoses and fireproof materials. That was established somewhat later on a site just to the north. And the village with the most mills was Caton, which at one point had 4, all on the same beck, all fed off Artle Beck, all water mills. A fair number of them built and developed in the late 18th century by Thomas Hodson, who was a West Indian, but more particularly slave trading merchant family. So they were responsible for that, and there's but various partnerships ran them. And we've got Low Mill, which is still the biggest and surviving mill there, and that is now housing or flats. We've got Willow Mill, which again dates back to the late 18th century, which is offices and warehouses. Rumble Row Mill has been demolished. There's a housing estate and a school. And Forge Mill, which gives away an earlier use of that site, is also housing. So we still have the buildings, we still have that legacy, but we don't have the industry. Now the other thing, apart from water, is wood. We tend to forget woodland industries, but if you look at this map of the Hyndburn Valley, just to the sort of northeast of Wray, in fact where I live, at mill houses, there's a clue. What I'm going to talk about, you'll see that all around it are coppice woods. And coppicing is where one chops down the trees when they're growing and you get extra shoots, which can then be used for poles, lathes, turning and all sorts of things like that. So the woods are extensively managed for a purpose. There are a variety of things you can do with coppice woods, but one thing you can do is have a bobbin mill, which again grows on the back of textile trade, because these are growing on the back of demand for bobbins in the textile trade. And the mill at Mill Houses was originally a corn mill, but by the 1820s had become a bobbin mill. The rarest bobbin mills in the Lune Valley in the early 19th century. This is a map showing where they are. There's one at Cowan Bridge, which I still find difficult to believe is on the site of the old clergy daughters' school where the Brontes went. It later becomes a bobbin mill, but that seems to burn down in the late 1830s. There's one at Burton in Lonsdale, briefly it would seem, in the 1840s. There's one at Mill Houses from the 1820s, with one right up in the fells at Tatham Fell. Wray did have one in the 1820s briefly. All the mills in Caton, apart from Low Mill, at one time were also bobbin mills. So the bobbin industry, and there's also one at Littledale, now the site of a scout camp. So at one point there were quite a few bobbin mills, so it's quite an active industry. We don't have many pictures of these places. This is the Burton in Lonsdale mill, much bigger and developed later, as you can see, with glass sort of addition on the side, because it was used for a stereoscopic photographic works. And that's an example of the works they were doing. It's to give 3D visions where they told stories through photography. So Burton in Lonsdale mill, I can't find no evidence after the 1850s. Lowgill, similarly, right up in the Tatham Fells, now a house. That seemed to only last about 10, 12 years. A lot of these are very small, in other words. The most long-lasting is the one at Mill Houses, which is founded by a man who comes down from near Kendal in 1827 to take the mill. And his family run it to the 1890s and then 1880s, I apologise, and then another family run it right through to the 1940s. It increasingly diversifies into chair legs, broom handles, rolling pins, anything you can turn, in other words. We do have some idea of how this functioned from the remains that are still there, but also from some drawings that was done by a man who lived in the farm next door when he was a boy and later became an engineer. And he did some plans showing the gearing and the waterworks and what the buildings look like. And this gives some idea, I think, of what it's like. You've got the mill race, if you look at the top map, you've got the mill race coming off from the weir right up the valley, runs along the sides of the fields, past the farm, and then down to the bobbin mill, where it comes into a small pond, and then there is a launder, a sort of aqueduct, that takes it so it can be an overshot water wheel, and then a mill race bypass for water when it's not in use, or if there's too much water. At this point, it's referring to the turbine house. So the water wheel has been replaced by a turbine. There is also a timber yard, a sawmill, and some stores. So he's outlined what it was like. And he's done some lovely sketches and drawings, really, of what it was like in his childhood. And it's basically been like this, I think, since the early 19th century. So we have the wood store, the store shed, the saw shed, and the bobbin mill itself. He's done one at the other end, showing the launder coming in and then going into the turbine house. Now, turbines, I think we ought to make more use of nowadays, myself. Turbines were replacements for water wheels. They're much more efficient. They need very little maintenance. There's very little left of this. We do have some pictures of the launder taken in one of the very cold winters between the wars with ice all over the side. And we've got a little bit of where the old water wheel was in place. But otherwise, there's only fragments left of what the turbine was. The turbine was a Gilks water turbine made in Kendal, which were still are a very important firm selling turbines all over the world. But they clearly did small-scale ones for insertions in mills like this. And we know from this who put it in. It was a 10 brake horsepower mill turbine paid for by the Fosters of Hornby Castle, who were the owners of the mill. This man tenants it throughout. And it's got the speed and cubic feet. We've got the full details, basically, still of what this mill was like. So water turbines, I think, are an aspect of this industry that allows water power to continue longer than one might imagine. Very little left of it today. That was an aerial photograph from the 1960s where you could see the base of the bobbin mill, and also the store shed. And this is early 2000s, where all we've got left is the pillars of the launder and the mill race bypass channel. It's now part of a garden, so please don't go looking for it. The last surviving one, and probably the most successful, were the Wildmans. And Thomas Wildman, who founded this mill, actually worked initially at mill houses, so there is a sort of movement of bobbin makers up and down the valley. That lasted till the 1970s, and they were famous for their picking stick, which I won't go into explain, and I hope nobody asks me in detail about. But they made a variety of different bobbins and later wood turnings. So it lasted much longer than one might imagine. But there are all sorts of other industries based on the woods, not just supplying stuff for the housing building in Lancaster with beams and big sawmill activities, but there's basket making, there's clog making at one point, there's the wheelwrights, there's the usual sorts of woodland trades, as you would imagine. And one that is shown up there on the top left is swill basket making, which is using strips of oak to make baskets, which would have been extensively used at the time for domestic and agricultural and industrial purposes, for that matter. And these were done by hand. The industry only died out in the 1950s, because it's still described by Jessica Lofthouse when she visits the area. And she describes Mr. Bevan's wood swill making place. And there was one based at mill houses, because clearly where there's a timber operating mill, there are likely to be wood that this man can use. He's described as a whisket manufacturer, which is the same sort of name for the basket. And it's Mr. Fleming, who also comes down from the Lake District. There are huge connections with the South Lakes industry, which was thriving at that time. And again, although it's easy to miss it, the bill is drawn up and acknowledged and receipted by his wife. So although all the workers that we're looking at are men, I suspect behind the scenes we will find that wives and other people are involved. There's also another woodland-based industry which seems a little odd, which is iron. But then we've got to remember, until Abraham Darby's inventions, iron relied on charcoal or coppice wood. And since there was plenty of wood round Halton, what we get from the late 1740s, early 1750s, it's not quite sure when, is a furnace established at Halton, owned by Abraham Rawlinson and Miles Burkitt, who were West Indian merchants. So one suspects that some of this product is being shipped overseas. And the furnace lasts until the early 19th century, when clearly it ceases to be as viable as a charcoal-based industry. There's also a forge down at the Halton Mill site, and this firm also run a furnace at Leighton, up near Silverdale, where there's also plenty of wood. It is easier to bring the iron to the furnace than it is to take the wood to the iron makers. There are clearly sort of problems by the early 19th century, and there's quite a few sale notices. How successful they were, I don't know. But this is the desirable works of the Halton Iron Company, with two forges, two blast furnaces, because they own them both, and a foundry. And the forges are situated at Halton and up at Leighton. And it describes what's in this furnace and forge fairly in detail. What I find interesting, since people say, where did they get the iron from? Well, they must have brought it from Furness. they are actually processing waste iron or scrap iron from that advert. So interesting that it's here. The other sort of, to move on a little, charcoal burning is replaced by coal in the iron industry. We don't move on to that round here, but clearly coal is an important resource, and this valley has coal. It doesn't have enough coal, is what I would say. And clearly by the 1830s, Lancaster merchants and manufacturers are anxious to see if they can find coal in sufficient deposits to develop the industry. And they form the Lancaster Mining Company, a variety of names that will be familiar to those who look at the industry and trade of Lancaster. And they get John Phillips, the nephew of William Smith, who did the first geological map of Britain, to come up here to survey and tell us what are the chances of us having coal up here. It's not that there wasn't coal. There's loads of evidence of small-scale mining over an earlier period, all the way through this area. In fact, at all these places, coal outcrops at Quernmore, there's coal up the Littledale and Littledale Valley, at Halton near Hornby, Roeburndale, which is now fell farming area, various pits in Wray with Bobbin and in Tatham, mining around Bentham, and also Burton in Lonsdale, and of course into the 20th century at Ingleton on a much larger scale. As you can see, this is a rather nice estate sale map from Wray in 1773 with the coal cart coming down what I can assure you is a very steep hill, and on the top piece map you can see the sign saying "to the coal pits." So it was clearly there in the 18th century. If you drive down the 683, you'll be aware of this place. It's the old toll house at Halton. And if you look on the OS map to the left of that picture, you can see at one point up behind it there was an engine house and coal pits. So there was mining even there. And on the map beneath, coal pits and Tatham, if you look at the top left, it says free school. So in front of this school there were quarries and bell pits. Health and safety wasn't clearly an issue in terms of schooling in those days. But throughout those fields, there's no sign whatsoever that these had ever been coal pits now. There's coal pits all over that area. So coal pits were widely distributed. They're worked fairly primitively. Where it outcrops, they would have an adit mine that they went in on from the side, on the horizontal. Otherwise, they were largely bell pits, where people would either climb down using ladder if it wasn't very deep, or more likely be winched down on a windlass like this, or possibly a horse gin. And those are also used for bringing up the coal. The coal seams here are pretty thin, which is one of the problems, so they're not going to be a major operation in most cases. And this is the Burke's Colliery up at Wray with Bobbin, just at the time it closed. This is the map in 1882. And as you can see from that, it's not one person working these pits. It's a variety of different names on that map. Mr. Kays, Mr. Clarkson, Mr. Newby have all got little concessions that they are working themselves. They're described as coal masters, but there might be just them and a man and a boy, because it's pits like this that continue to employ underage much longer than they should have done. There's absolutely nothing visible nowadays. That's what's left today. You can see the two quarries, bottom right and mid left in the field, but you wouldn't at one point have known that at one point that was riddled with coal bell pits. Rather more evidence survives for another of the Tatham pits at Clintsfield, in the north part of Tatham, just south of the River Wenning, between Wennington and Low Bentham. And this is a 1786 map for Yates, showing the coal pit there. If you look on the aerial view on Google Earth nowadays, you can see the remains of bell pits and gin operations, in that there are various circular marks on the fields. So there is still some evidence there, and there's also a building, the engine house, which was built in the late 1830s and still standing, and it's now a scheduled monument as well as a listed building. If you want to know more about this, there's an article on the Tatham History website written by myself and Mike Kelly, who's a geologist and local historian. So we do have evidence for the fairly major workings at that point. And Mike Kelly has actually managed to reconstruct how the engine house would have operated. The problem with the coal round here is not only that they are very thin seams, but that they also go down at fairly steep angles, so they're not easy to work. And also there are faults. So they can dig a bell pit, they can go down into the seam, go either way for a certain distance, to bring it out, take it up, then they dig another bell pit to go down and connect with what they hope is this coal seam. The trouble is, as this diagram beneath shows that Mike Kelly's allowed me to use, it suddenly disappears and drops, so they won't find coal. So we've got to be careful that some of these things that look like coal pits might not be coal pits. They might be thinking they could find some, but there isn't actually anything there. So it's not good coal to work. It's not good steaming coal. It's difficult to get out. It's small scale, and by the 1880s, it's gone. The last of the pits is in Tatham at that point. Other sorts of mineral quarrying is stone. This is Backsbottom Quarry, just up Roeburndale behind Wray, which operated on a large scale, producing slates and flags for roofs and paving stones, and I think was sold quite widely in Morecambe and Lancaster as well as locally. And Backsbottom operated intermittently over, well, through the 18th century onwards. Again, the rights are owned by Hornby Castle as Lord of the Manor, and these are let out for tenants. And you can see from this advert, hopefully if it's big enough, that Mr. Kays, who has taken Backsbottom Pit, has also got Tatham Colliery. So these people had several sorts of concessions going on from the Lords of the Manor, and that's in the 1850s. In terms of what else was mined, well, the shale upon Caton Moors. This is the Lunesdale Brick and Tube Works, which you wouldn't know was there when you drive down the A683. All that's left is some very dirty rubble, which looks like it's black soil until you handle it and find that it's sooty. In those trees to the right as you're going up the 683. And if you go on the road from Claughton up to Brookhouse, just in the fields, you can see the remains of the tramway that brought down the shale from up on Caton. There's one brick there that's been illustrated on a website that just has pictures of bricks, donated by Ian Miller, who's another speaker on this series, who says he likes to take pictures of bricks. So that's for you for later, Ian. So Lunesdale Brick and Tube Works is operated initially by a local farmer, and then he makes it into a limited company in the 1870s. But by the 1890s, it's struggling, not least of which because the Lord of the Manor and the new brickworks just up the road take him to court saying you've never had permission to get the minerals from up there anyway. So they merge with the newly formed Claughton Manor Brickworks, formed in 1897. There's two sites there. This Ordnance Survey map shows the old one, which did have a tramway going over the road until relatively recently, but has now been demolished. But the current site is just to the northeast of that. It is operated now by a firm called Forterra, although if you go on the web it often says it's still Hanson Bricks, but there's been a change of ownership. It's still a very big site that's still producing bricks on a large scale for sale over a wide area. And amazingly, it's still got the original ropeway from 1924, which crosses the A683, which is the only gravity-operated ropeway in the country, I believe. A very environmentally friendly way of bringing down perhaps not very environmentally friendly mining material, but they keep it going. There's a wonderful video, several videos of it on YouTube that will show you how it winds its way up the valley. Clay is also mined for pottery. This is particularly at Burton in Lonsdale, up on the Greta, and you can see from this Ordnance Survey map there are at least 3 there, but at one point there have been 16 documented separate sites that are known to have operated at various times in Burton in Lonsdale. This is a picture from 1870, probably taken to show the new church that's just been built up on the hill, which is somewhat out of scale for the size of the village. And it shows some of the small-scale potteries down in the valley. But they were all along that valley using local coal, Black Burton as it was known, and they would then use that for firing up the pottery. This is one of the adit mines, bringing out the coal, and there they are bunging the clay. And the pots were thrown by hand on wheels on these small potteries. So it's sort of hand-thrown pottery of a fairly country basic nature. There's been a recent book published by Andrew White privately, called Black Burton, the Yorkshire Pottery Village, which illustrates some of the types of pots. He does warn us that the pots that survive are not the everyday pots. These are the special pots that are done for special occasions or for puzzle jugs or something like that. So these are probably not used and therefore are not typical of the mass of the output, which was basically country pottery. Some of this might well have been exported to the West Indies because they have been operated since the early 18th century at least, possibly longer. So there you've got some examples that are in local museums, and this is another one, an agate, where they mix different coloured clays in a swirl. But 20th century they're making plant pots, for example. But they also move into stoneware in the 19th century, which requires a hotter kiln. And this is a rare example of a stamp on one of those stonewares, which are the sort of stone flagons that you would get spirits or liquid potions for medicine in. And these were then wrapped in osier baskets, or as the phrase was used for these men, wand weavers, which I think is a wonderful occupation for the time. The centre of osier basket making was along the Lune at Arcombe, but they also went to Burton in Lonsdale to wrap these stoneware flagons in osier baskets. So basket making is another branch of that. And hats. Hats were made extensively, again, like pottery, in small-scale workshops. So very little remains of these, really. There's very little physical evidence. We're left with big mills, but as you've seen, there's virtually no evidence of a lot of the coal mining, or very little of the bobbins. Most of the other industry has disappeared without trace. Felt hats were made in small workshops, by hand, using wool, and they were tended to make felt hats. There's evidence for them up in Quernmore, in Bentham, Lancaster itself, and Wray, and a lot of these were exported to the West Indies for use on the plantations, felt hats. There's an article by Christine Workman in the Rural Industries of the Lune Valley about the hat making. One connection Wray had was with Christie's of London. They produced hat bases for Christie's in the early 19th century because of a Quaker connection. So Quakers again appear there. This is a hat factory up in Quernmore, photographed by Chris Workman some years ago. And there's an advert from Mr. Wildman of Wray for making available a hatting shop in Wray. One final industry, which I know nothing about at all, except what I've been told by David Kenyon, the local historian in Wray, and that was nail making, hand nail makings. It says on the left-hand side, general purpose nails, actual size. Well, in his book they are, but clearly how big they are will depend on what you're viewing this slideshow on. But different types of handmade nails. There's nothing to indicate that there was any nail making in Wray, and very little artefacts have survived. This is a cooling tray that David is aware of, that is photographed on the right. And there's the last nail maker, one of the last, a Kenyan. William and his wife were Anne. And as you can see, 14 in 1841, 1 in 1871. And that has been the fate of most of the rural industries in the Lune Valley. There's no pottery making at Burton in Lonsdale. There is a potter operating at Bentham, but not in Burton in Lonsdale. There's no bobbin making. There's no textile factories operating, except fire armour in Bentham. There's no nail making, there's no hat making. The population of the Lune Valley in the early 19th century grew more rapidly in the first few decades than Lancaster. So industry wasn't urban, it was rural. But the story from then onwards has been a decline of industry and employment in the countryside. And so we have therefore very little evidence left of these industries. But if you'd like to know more, there's quite a lot being written on this, and I'll leave you with this slide, which shows you some of the covers of some of the books. David Kenyon's book, quite a few of these now you'll probably only find second-hand because they're out of print, but David Kenyon's book on Wray Remembered is a beautifully illustrated book, if I can give that a plug. And there's various books by Phil Hudson on coal industry, Mike Kelly on geology, Andrew White on pottery, a wider book on linen in the northwest, a Murray Humphreys book on Craven area, and one I edited 20 years ago, I find frightening, on a variety of industries in the area. So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and the next time you wander around this beautiful area, just bear in mind that that field could well have been a coal mine at one point. Thank you very much.